Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me today. In this video, we're going to continue our exploration of the filters inside Photo RAW, and we're going to move on to the next 10 filters inside of the Effects tab. We're going to cover how to use them, when to use them, why you should use them, and some helpful tips and tricks along the way that you can use on your own photography. So now I'm inside ON1 Photo RAW 2020, and I've grabbed this landscape photograph here. And inside of the Edit module, I'm in the Develop tab, and this photo originally was pretty overexposed. But since we're not talking too much about the Develop tab or my tone and color pane, all I'm going to show you is just what I've done to this shot. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it's a pretty overexposed photograph. So inside of my tone and color, I've gone down, I've adjusted the exposure, I've boosted my contrast, I've pulled up on my midtones, my shadows, my whites a little bit to kind of bring back some life into the shot, and then I pulled back on my blacks so that there's some true black in the shot and there's some contrast and it's not so flat. So just going in there, kind of toning it down, making sure everything looks more cohesive in the shot. And that way when we add on filters, we can see and understand a lot better of what the filters do when they're applied to the photograph rather than applying them with kind of an overexposed image. So now that we've set our base look for our photograph, we can head into the Effects tab here, and I'll add a filter. And if you didn't watch the first Power Filters video, when you add the filter right here, we have this filters dialog, and we can actually go in here and see what each filter does to our shot by just hovering over it. And it will give a description on the right of what that filter does, and also a before and after with that filter applied to a photograph. Also, below that, we have our keywords. So it's going to give us keywords that we can search in this search bar here, and it will show us all of the filters that we're looking for. So let's say we're looking for a filter that applies detail. I can type in detail, and now I have all of these different filters here that will bring detail onto my shot. So now we can move on to the next 10 filters, and we're going to start with this first one, which is curves. And the curves dialog is a powerful advanced tool for adjusting contrast and color. So I'll just click on curves. And the curves filter, once I apply it to this shot, it's one of those filters that doesn't do anything unless it's modified. So by applying this curves filter, I first have to go in here and I have to modify it a bit to actually see the results on my image. So the tone curve is a great way to modify all of the different tones in your shot. And to understand the tone curve, let's first start out here at the bottom of it. So at the bottom left here, we have this point right here on our graph. So this point is your blacks. That's the darkest area on your shot is right here on this point in the tone curve. And as we move up the tone curve, we brighten the tones. So we have our darks right here, and then as we move up on the tone curve, we have kind of our shadowy tones to our mid-tones, and then we move on to kind of our highlights and then our whites. And we can also see that by these two gradients here. This left gradient is black at the bottom, and then it moves up to kind of gray and then white, and same thing on the bottom. Now, with our black point here, this is mainly used to control the contrast within your shot. So with our black point here, if we want to modify the blacks in our shot, we can either pull them to the right to add in contrast, or we can pull it straight up to bring in sort of a fade. So if I click on this black point here and I pull it to the right, you can see it's adding in a ton of black to the shot, and it's making it really, really contrasty. So if I pull it to the right, it will add in blacks. Now if I pull it straight up, it's going to incorporate sort of a faded look because it's trying to pull out all of those different blacks within the scene. So if I pull up, I get a fade. And if I pull to the right, it's going to add in blacks. And if you want to incorporate kind of both at the same time, you can always pull this up a little bit and then just pull it to the right. And then you'll get sort of a faded, moody look onto your shot where you're bringing in a fade, but you also have some contrast to back it up. So I'm just going to reset this here. And one thing that's really popular, and so if I go into my curve here and I drop a point right in the middle, that's going to make sure that my midtones aren't modified whenever I modify this area on my tone curve. So now if I click on this point here and I pull this up and down, this is going to be modifying my shadow tones. So you can see if I pull this down, it's darkening the shadowy tones within my shot. And if I pull it up, it's pulling out the brightness of all of those dark tones. So I'll just drag this down to kind of the middle area where it was at its default. And then I'm going to drop a point up here in my kind of highlight area. And now watch as I play with my midtone point. So if I pull this up, see how it's pulling kind of removing some of those midtones in here, and then if I pull it up, it's pulling out all of those bright middle gray tones within my scene. Pull it down, pull it up. Just going to drag it right there. And then we have our highlight point. So now if I modify the highlights here, you can see it's strictly modifying all of those bright areas within my shot, and it's not modifying the midtones or the shadow tones. So I'll just drag this right there. So I'll just go up here and reset this. And then we also have our red, green, and blue channels that we can modify as well. And they work the same way as the All tab does, except when you're choosing a specific channel here, like I have red chosen right there, in this red channel, now I can modify the reds in specific tones in my shot. So if I drop a point here in my midtones, let's say I want to remove all of the red from my highlights. So if I go up here to my highlight channel and I drag this down, you can see that when I'm removing those red tones from my highlights, it's incorporating those blues and the greens, so we get this sort of aqua color up here because I've removed all of these different reds. And I can do the same thing with my shadow tones. So if I want to remove reds from the shadows, I can bring some of that blue and green in, or I can bring more reds into my shadow tones this way. And same thing with my greens or my blues. So if I want to bring in more green to the midtones in the shot, I could drop points in my shadows and my highlights, and then I'll just pull up on my midtones, and that's going to bring in a lot more green into those midtone areas on my photograph. Now keep in mind that these channels here are pretty strong and pretty intense when you do modify them, so just be careful and don't pull up too much, because you will incorporate a really, really bright shade of green or blue or red or whatever color you pick on these tabs. So I'm just going to turn this off or reset it for now. And to sort of set the base look on this photo, I'm going to use a simple S-curve. And S-curves are a really, really awesome curve for the curves filter because they allow you to kind of darken up the contrast while keeping the integrity of your midtones and your highlights. So all I'm going to do here to create this S-curve is I'm going to go down to my shadow tones here. I'm going to drop a point, and then I'm just going to drag it down a little bit until I get sort of a nice kind of mood into the shot. Going to add in some nice tonal contrast in here. And then I'm going to head up here to my highlight area, and I'm just going to pull that up, and that's going to create that sort of S on the shot. So now I have this S curve in here, and it's darkened up the shadows, but it's also allowed me to brighten up these highlights. The great thing about the S curve is it keeps your midtones really fluent. So you can see that it's not modifying my midtones too much, it's only really modifying my highlights and my shadow tones. And it's a pretty bit strong onto this shot, but we can always lower the opacity. But you can see right away that if I turn this off and on here, it does a really good job of applying tonality and life to the shot just by using that simple S curve. And a cool thing you can do with the curves filter is you can actually protect the colors within your shot by using a blend mode. So if I turn this curves filter off and on here, we can see it richens up these greens quite a bit. If we zoom in here and we turn this off and on, they're a lot more rich and saturated now because we've modified our shadow tones. And when we're removing exposure and dimming things down, we're going to incorporate saturation because we're removing middle grays within our colors. So what we can do to protect our colors is we can head up to our gear icon here. I'll go into my mode, and I'll head down to luminosity. So now if I turn this off and on, it's only applying this tone curve to the luminance, or the contrast, the brightness, the midtones, things like that, and it's avoiding all of the colors within the shot. So I'm protecting all of the color saturation, all of my hues, all of the color integrity within my photograph, but it's allowing me to modify all of the tones in my shot so I can bring in some nice tonal contrast with this tone curve. So if I zoom in here to these colors and I go to my mode, I'll click on normal, and then we'll go down to luminosity. So it's pretty saturated, and now let's go to luminosity. And you can really see it in here. Normal, see it's a lot more saturated, and then luminosity. So that's the tone curve and the curves filter. And the curves filter is an awesome filter for pretty much any photograph that you want to apply it to. I would recommend using the S-curve a lot, especially in portraits. It makes kind of the cinematic look. But if you are using the S-curve with portraits, be careful about your shadows because you can darken up a lot of the areas within your scene and kind of lose some of those darker details. So just be careful with the S-curve. So now we'll move on and add the next filter, which is dynamic contrast. Dynamic contrast adds clarity, also known as tonal contrast, to your photo, making it pop. So I'll add dynamic contrast here, and you can see right away that if I turn this off and on, it brings in a lot of detail into the shot. Now with the dynamic contrast filter, it's a really easy to filter to modify. Basically you have your dynamic contrast and then 3 different sliders. So you have your small, your medium, and your large. And to explain these, I'm just going to pull these down to 0. And so if I pull up on the small, that's going to incorporate that small detail, really kind of fine detail, like in these trees back here. And if you had like a dog, it would really kind of bring out those fine hairs and the texture in them. So you can see by pulling up on this, it's bringing out all of that nice, small, fine detail and texture within the shot. And then we have medium. So if I pull up on medium, that's going to be kind of the step above, if you will. So basically that's pulling out kind of these middle contrasty areas within the shot. And then we have large. So if I pull up on large, you can see it's a step above medium. It's allowing it to kind of bring contrast to the scene as a whole and not actually nitpick the small contrast and texture areas. So I'm just going to pull this back to 0 and the large back to 0. And so basically the dynamic contrast filter is just like that. You know, you come in here and you modify, you know, how much detail you want. You can either bring in small, medium, or large. I'm probably just going to pull up on my large a little bit and then maybe my medium just a hair. Perfect. That looks pretty good like that. And then we have our tone area down here as well. So our tone allows us to modify the tonalities within our shot. So if I want to bring in a little bit more mood to the shot, I can actually come into my dynamic contrast filter and I could lower my shadow tones. That'll kind of moody up things. I can lower my whites to kind of dim things down. I can incorporate true black into my shot. I can modify my highlights, and then we'll just bring a little bit more white back there. And then we can modify our vibrance. So if we want to incorporate color, we can do that as well. Maybe we can just dim this down a hair. And so just by using this one filter and modifying a bunch of these different sliders here, if I turn this off and on now, you know, we've added in detail, but we've also modified a lot more of the other tonalities in the shot as well, just by using this one filter. And there's also a lot of awesome preset styles in here. Like grunge contrast is really strong, but if you have, let's say, a desert shot, this texture enhancer is really awesome for all of those kind of sandy textures within your scene. So dynamic contrast, another amazing filter, and I would recommend using it on anything that needs detail, landscapes especially, macro shots. If you're using it on portraits, I would recommend masking it away from any faces or any skin, just so you'd avoid kind of crunching up those areas. Those kind of need to be left nice and delicate and soft. So if you do need to mask quickly, I'm just going to reset this to kind of its natural state. If you do need to mask quickly, just grab your dynamic contrast filter, hit B on your keyboard. That'll grab you your masking brush. And also if you want to mask out quickly, you could hit M on your keyboard. That'll grab you your masking bug. And let's say you have a sky area on your shot that you want this to be removed from. You could just go up to your presets, make sure it's set to linear top so that the filter is being applied to the bottom of the shot, and then you could just drop this down. So it's only being applied to the foreground area, and then I could turn this off and on here. And now we only have this dynamic contrast filter applied to the foreground, and it's not being applied to the top area. So if you are adding dynamic contrast, just kind of pay attention to what you're applying it to. If you add it to a portrait or something like that, just be aware that you could be crunching up some of the details within the skin and some of the textures. But all around, awesome, amazing filter. Really allows you to bring out all of the different details within a scene really, really quickly. So we'll move on to the next filter here, which is film grain. So the film grain filter allows you to incorporate film grain onto your shot. If we add a filter and go back to that dialog, adds a texture of film grain which can appear like noise. It is handy for creating a more authentic film appearance. So one thing that I like to use the film grain filter with is a filter we looked at in the previous video, which was the black and white filter. So I'm just going to click on black and white just for the sake of this video, and then I'm just going to pull this up here. So inside of my black and white, I'm going to actually choose red here. And then I'm going to go up to my film grain here, and now we can actually get a better idea of what this film grain filter does. So I'm just going to zoom in here to this bottom area of the shot, and then I'm going to go to my film grain, And with the film grain filter, basically you choose what film style you want to emulate. So if you want to see a lot of film grain, choose a higher number. 3200, for example, is going to bring in a strong amount of film grain. So if I turn this off and on, you can kind of see it incorporates a lot of grain really quickly into the scene. And then we have amount, so this is amount of the film grain onto your shot, and then we have size. So if you want a really, really kind of vintagey look, you can pull this all the way up to 100. And so if I zoom out here and I turn this off and on, you can see it really adds in a lot of grain, bringing that sort of vintagey look back onto the photograph. And that's kind of it for the film grain filter. You know, you have these different preset styles in here that you can choose, and then you can go in and just kind of customize to which film grain style you want. And again, just the higher the number, the more film grain you're going to have. I'd recommend using like the 3200s. They're really awesome filters. And the film grain filter works really, really great on black and white portraits or black and white landscapes. I really like film grain on black and white because it kind of attests to that old-timey feel of the photographs. But you can use it on really whatever you want to just make a little more vintagey or aged. So we'll move on to the next photo here and the next filter. So with this photograph, I've gone in and I've changed the camera profile and I've chosen AI Auto just to quickly kind of develop the tones in the shot. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, nothing too crazy, just sort of a basic exposure modification. And so we'll go into the effects tab, we'll add a filter, and we'll move on to the next filter, which is the glow filter. So glow adds a soft focus to your photograph. So if I add glow here, so with the glow filter, it's a really easy filter to use. Basically, you have your amount slider, and this will control the amount of the glow. And then we have the halo. So if we have our glow amount to 100, the halo is basically going to soften that glow for us. It's going to bring in sort of that halo-y look onto our shot. So if I pull this all the way up, you can see it kind of softens things up a little bit. And then we have our mode down here. So this is basically changing the blend mode of our glow filter. Now I would recommend using about 3 of these. Multiply is going to darken everything by at least 1 stop. And then we have screen, which is going to brighten everything. And then we have our soft light. Now soft light is probably my recommended one. It really brings just sort of that contrasty glow look onto your photograph. It really works well, especially with water shots. So once you've kind of gone in and played with the glow filter a little bit, I would recommend going into these preset styles in here. There's a lot of awesome preset styles in here, so if we just hover down these, they all do a ton to kind of help out the photograph. And I really, really, really like glow filters, especially on scenes where there's water. And I specifically, or I tend to apply the glow filter specifically to certain areas so that it's not on subjects or clouds or things like that. And what I tend to use whenever I'm applying that to water is I use this Charge More Subtle. Now if I turn this off and on here, I really like what it does to kind of bring in some contrast into the water and kind of make it nice and glowy. But I'm going to pull down this halo part quite a bit, and I'm going to pull up the amount to 100. And with this shot, I really don't want the glow on our subject here, and I don't want it on the clouds in the shot. I only want it on this foreground area in the water. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my masking options, and I'm going to create a quick luminosity mask. So with the glow filter, I really like using luminosity masks because it allows me to target other areas in my shot rather than kind of glowing up my subject. So with masking, if you're not familiar with masking, white reveals and black conceals. So if I'm viewing my mask here, I can see that it's all white, meaning it's revealing the entire glow filter. So if I want to apply this selectively with a luminosity mask, I can just click on Lumen. Now I'm going to view this mask. And with the luminosity mask, the way you have to modify it is with this levels slider here. And the level slider is really easy to use. It's kind of like your tone curve. Whereas this far left point here is our shadows, or our blacks, and then we have our midtones, and then we have our whites, or our highlights. Well, with the level slider, if you pull something to the right, it's going to remove that tone from your mask. If you pull it to the left, it's going to incorporate that tone into your mask. Because after all, luminosity masks are basically taking your photograph and it's telling, hey, Photo RAW, here are all of the brighter areas within my shot. Apply the filter to these areas and avoid the darker areas. Basically, your luminosity mask is targeting the brighter areas within your scene and applying the filter to that. So if we want to modify the mask, we can kind of target those brighter areas and modify our midtones and our highlights all at the same time. So inside the glow filter, I'm going to grab this far left point on my level slider, and that's my shadows. So if I pull this to the right, it's going to remove my shadow tones from the mask. Now I'm going to grab this midtone point and I'm going to pull that to the left, and that's going to add more midtones into the mask. So now I've incorporated more midtones into my shot. Now let's grab this highlight point and we're going to pull this to the left as well. And that's going to allow this to bring in kind of all of those different tones within the shot. So now we're only applying this glow filter to these white areas on the water, and it's avoiding our subject here, but it's applied all the way up top on our clouds. So all we're going to do is we're just going to increase our brush size, make sure our brush is set to paint out, and I'm just going to paint this out from our subject. Just like that. So now I'll view my photograph here, and then if I turn this glow filter off and on, it does a ton to the water in here, but it's not being applied anywhere else on the shot. So if I turn this off and on again, it does a lot to the water in here. I really like what it does to kind of contrast the scene up. And we can always go in here and we can adjust our modes a little bit. I do like that overlay. I really like that. And then we can feather this quite a bit. So it's kind of a softer mask. And then if we turn this off and on now, ooh, I really like overlay. So maybe we should stick with overlay for this shot. But glow, a really awesome filter for really anything where you're trying to kind of soften things up or bring a glowy look into the shot. I recommend it on water. I really like what it does to water. I typically use it on any shot where I have kind of moving or flowing water. And I really like to use that luminosity mask again to kind of target those specific tones in my shot. But you could really use it for anything. I would recommend masking it out to some areas, or at least making sure that it's applied to the areas that you want, because it can add a weird look onto darker areas on your shot or really, really bright areas on your photograph. So the glow filter, awesome for pretty much anything you want to apply a glow to, portraits, automotive, landscapes, macro. Really, really kind of diverse filter for your photos. So we can move on to the next photograph here. And with this shot, I've actually gone in and I've clicked AI Auto just to develop the photo's tonality really easily. So if I hit the # key on my keyboard to view the original, nothing too crazy, just added a little bit of contrast, I think, and kind of boosted these shadow tones within the shot. So let's go into the Effects tab here. We'll add a filter, and we can move on to the next filter, which is the Grunge filter. So this filter is used to add a dirty or grungy look to your photo. So if I click on this, you can see that it immediately darkens things up. It adds in a nice grunge or mood to the photo. The Grunge filter is similar to your bleach bypass filter, where it kind of brings on that desaturating, contrasted look. But with the Grunge filter, you're using film grain rather than a photo filter. So in bleach bypass, you can use your photo filter to incorporate some color. Well, with the Grunge filter, you can modify your film grain and add in a little bit of glow. So with the Grunge filter, it's really easy to use. You have your amount slider, which is kind of the amount of the grunge on your shot. And then we have brightness. So if you want to make it a little bit brighter or darker, you can do that here. And then saturation, if you want to incorporate more color, you can incorporate more color into your shot. And then detail, so if you want to make it more crunchy, more kind of make the details pop out a little bit more, you can add that detail slider. And then we have glow, so if we want to bring in sort of a glowy look into the shot. Now with the Grunge filter, I'd recommend using a different mode than lighten for your glow. I would go down here and use like overlay or soft light or even multiply. And that's going to make it a lot darker on your scene and kind of be more reflective of that grungy look that you're kind of trying to apply. But you could just lower that to 0 and not worry about the glow. And then we have film grain, which we could modify with our amount slider, and then we could pull up on the size a little bit. So if you look in the background here, and I pull this amount up, you can see it just kind of incorporates some nice film grain onto the shot. So I'll just reset this here and I'll zoom out. And with the Grunge filter, I typically go in here and I use these preset styles. So if you click on these more styles, there's a lot of just kind of preset styles in here that you can use. And one of my favorites is this frumpy. And the reason I like the frumpy is because it brings in kind of a grungy, contrasted look, but it adds in some glow. And it really reminds me of like those vintagey photographs from way back in the day. So if I turn this off and on, just by that one filter, you can see it does a lot to the shot. And what you could do with this preset is you could modify it to kind of your liking. So if I wanted a little bit more color, I could add some of that nice color in there. And then I could save this as a preset style. So if I want to use this as a style later on, I could go into my More menu, and I could go down to Save New Style, and then I could just name it Fave Frump or Frumpy or whatever. And now you got a preset style that you can access anytime you go back into Photo RAW, and there you go. So Grunge filter, really awesome filter for kind of desaturating your shot, bringing a nice mood onto your frame. And you could pretty much use it for any particular aspect of photography, you know, portraits, landscapes, really anything. Grunge filter. And we'll move on to the next filter, which is the HDR look filter. So this filter recreates the HDR style of tone mapping with accentuated edges and sharpening. This one, like dynamic contrast, often benefits from masking or blend modes. So the HDR look is pretty much your dynamic contrast filter, but times like 10. So if I click on the HDR look filter, boom, you can see it automatically does a whole lot to the shot. Basically, the HDR look filter is taking my photograph and it's saying, hey, where's the shadow tones? Where's the detail? Let's pull all of that out. So in here, we can modify that by modifying our compression slider first. And that's basically the compression between your highlights and your shadow tones and how much you can see of both of them. So if I pull this down all the way, you can see I get more contrast because I can kind of see this little shadowy tone in here. But if I pulled up the compression all the way, it's going to try and reveal all of the shadow tones with all of the midtones and all of the highlights at the same time. So I get that high dynamic range look. So if I pull up on the compression, there we go. That's kind of that typical HDR look. So when you're modifying your HDR look, you can come in here, you could add more detail if you wanted to. And then we have clarity. And clarity is basically your micro contrast within the shot. So detail is kind of like our medium to large contrast. And then this is kind of our small detail. And so we have highlights. If we want to modify our highlights, our shadows, or our vibrance, we can do that in here. And then we have glow and grunge. So basically, these are the two sliders that we just went over these filters. So if we want to add in a nice glow, we could pull that up, and then I'll bring in sort of a glow onto the shot. And then if we want to bring in more of a desaturated, moody look, we could pull up the grunge slider, and that will do that. So with HDR look, I would recommend using it on landscapes. Typically, you pretty much only want HDR done on landscapes. I haven't really seen it done on portraits too often, but this would be great for a photograph, let's say, where there's a lot of detail in the foreground and in the background, or if you're focus stacking. This will allow you to kind of bring out all of the detail so that everything looks like it's in focus. This is a great filter for that. Similar to dynamic contrast, I would recommend masking it out if it's applied to an area that you don't want it applied to. For example, it's applied to this sky area. So if we make this pretty surreal here, you can see it kind of crunches up this sky area on the shot. So what you could do here is you could apply this selectively. So if I hit B on my keyboard, I could just mask this out from areas that I don't want it to be applied to. And then if I turn this off and on, then it's not crunching up my sky area as much. So yeah, HDR look filter, awesome filter for bringing in kind of that high dynamic range look onto your shot. Basically, you're taking your photograph and you're pulling out the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows, and you're compressing them together so you can see all of the range within your scene. And then we can move on. So we can move on to the next filter here. If we add a filter, we have the lens blur filter. So the lens blur filter is a filter that applies lens blur onto your shot. So if we go back to our filter dialog, this filter creates a blur based on a camera lens, such as a tilt shift or a shallow depth of field look. So if we go into our lens blur, we can modify the amount, we can make it more or less blurry. We can modify the optic quality, so if we pull this back, it'll make our bokeh look kind of crappy. And then if we pull it up, we can make it look really nice. I typically leave it in here, or about 10 or so. So we'll leave this amount, our amount up a little bit too. And then sides, This will only matter if you have your optic quality down, but this is basically modifying the look of your bokeh. And then we have curvature, so if we want it a little more small or big. Blooming is going to make the bokeh quite wide and kind of a little more circular and less sharp. And then we have brightness, so we can modify the brightness of the lens blur. And then we have contrast, so if we want to incorporate more contrast into the shot, we kind of have that detail slider right here. And then we have noise, so if we want to bring in noise to the shot, we can bring in noise. Basically, you're incorporating kind of a film grain look with this slider. But what I recommend using with the lens blur is maybe a tilt shift look. That's a pretty popular look with the lens blur filter. So all you have to do to create a tilt shift look is just click on tilt shift. And now I'll hit M on my keyboard. That'll grab me my masking bug. And now I can kind of rotate this reflected gradient a little bit better. Oops. We'll kind of feather it a little bit. Maybe pull this in. And now if I head over here, we'll kind of rotate it a little bit more. And now if I head over here and I turn this off and on, we're really kind of emulating that kind of tilt shift look, where if you were shooting kind of a miniature city or something like that, you could get that kind of tilt shift look. Just like that. And the lens blur filter, there's a lot of awesome preset styles in here as well that you could use. One of these that I really like is this softy vignette. It kind of blurs everything around the center of your shot, so you have that kind of blurred vignette. But the lens blur, awesome filter for pretty much any photograph where you need to blur something out specifically. I would recommend using the lens blur filter, but probably not the most common filter inside Photo RAW. All right, so new photograph, and we can move on to a new filter. So we'll head down here, and our next filter is the LUTs filter. And if you've watched any of my tutorials or webinars, you know that I'm a huge fan of the LUTs filter. The LUTs filter applies a color lookup table, LUT, to transform the underlying color of a photo. So if I click on LUTs, you can see instantly it brings out a lot of style onto a shot. So with the LUTs filter, it's pretty easy to use. All you do is you go into your category. So there's these different categories, and then you can add in your own. Just click on one, and then you can click on your LUT, and there's a bunch of different preset LUTs in here that you can choose to add onto your photograph. Now you can also go into this More menu, and it houses kind of all of the different styles in one area. Just like that. And one thing you could do with the LUTs filter is you can actually apply the contrast and the saturation. So if I want to bring in more contrast, I can pull this up. And then if I want to bring back some of that color, I can bring back some of the saturation here. This is kind of a bad example. There we go. So I can remove that contrast, add in some contrast, modify the saturation. And with these LUTs, there's a ton of LUTs in the presets of Photo RAW, but I would recommend using Classic is a really good one, Comfort's a really good one, Thorough's a really good one, Simple Warm is also a really, really good one. And then I tend to like this Brene, I can't remember what it's pronounced like, but I tend to like that one with kind of underexposed photographs. But the LUTs filter, awesome, awesome filter for applying quick styles onto your shot. You can see that if I go into this color grading and if I hover over any of these, it really brings in a lot of style really fast. What I would recommend doing with the LUTs filter is using a blend mode. Now with the LUTs filter, typically it's going to be modifying your color and your tonality. But if you wanted to choose one or the other, let's say we go into these and boom. Let's say we really like the color that it's applying to the photograph here, but if we turn this off and on, it's too bright and it's pulling out kind of too many of the midtones and highlights and things like that. So what we can do here to strictly apply this LUT filter to the color is we can head in here to our gear icon. I can go to my mode, and I'll just go down to color. So now it's taken the color of this LUT, but it's not pulling any of the midtone or highlight exposure modifications with it, so it's only applied to the color of my photograph. So now I'm just protecting the tonalities in my shot while kind of switching the color altogether. Another blend mode that you could use with the LUT filter is the luminosity blend mode. So let's say I go in here to my, my black and whites, and I'll hover down here. Oops. And I'll hover down here and oops, change it to normal. OK, so I'm in my blend mode normal now, and we'll go down to our category in black and white. And if I just hover over these, let's say I really like that. I really like what it's doing to the tonalities of this shot. For example, I like how it's darkening up the contrast. It's kind of moodifying the shot up a little bit. Well, if we only want that applied to our shot and we don't want the color to be modified at all, we can use the luminosity blend mode. So if I go into my mode here, I can go down to luminosity. And now if I turn this off and on, it's only pulling the luminosity, or that kind of the tonalities, the midtones, exposure, things like that, but it's not pulling any of that color modification with it. So we're strictly modifying the tonalities in our shot while protecting the color in our scene. So the color blend mode and luminosity blend mode, awesome blend modes for the LUT filter. And the LUTs filter, you could pretty much use the LUT filter for anything. I typically use it on almost every photograph I edit in ON1. So really powerful filter. And try using a blend mode with it, either the luminosity or the color. Or if you watch the first power filters, the hue blend mode, it's awesome with it too for certain LUTs. All right, so we can move on to the next photograph here. I'll add a filter, and we'll add the next filter, which is noise reduction. So noise reduction reduces luminance and color noise while maintaining photo detail. So if I click on this, I'm basically using this filter to take away kind of the graininess in shots where I have a higher ISO, or I'm shooting at night, or I'm shooting with some low light conditions. So if we zoom in here, I don't know if it's going to be too strong for you guys to see, but let me just pull up the exposure maybe a little bit. Just a hair, and then we'll pull midtones, add some contrast. OK, so hopefully you guys can see some of that noise in there. I tried to pick one with a lot of noise. So with this noise reduction filter, basically you're going to use this to modify the noise in specific tones. So this luminance slider is basically controlling the amount of noise reduction within your shot. So if I pull up on this, you can see it smooths out a lot of that noise. But by removing a lot of that noise, we're removing a lot of the detail. And also, the colors in our shot kind of get muddied up as well. So if we want to smooth out the colors, we can pull up on this color smoothing slider. So if I pull back on this, see how we get kind of these grainy areas around our colors? But if I pull up on this, it smooths out the edges of those colors. So we'll go over here a little bit. So color smoothing all the way down. See how this area looks kind of grainy? And if I pull that up, that smooths out those colors so they're not grainy and noisy. And so now that we've pulled away a lot of that luminance, we've removed some of the noise, but we've removed that detail. So if we want to incorporate more detail into our shot, we can just pull up on the detail slider. Now, keep in mind that when you pull up on the detail slider, you're going to be incorporating more noise back into your photo. So with the noise reduction filter, it's kind of a fine balance between that, removing the luminance and incorporating detail. So if we pull back on this just a little bit, about right there, now we have a strong amount of noise reduction, but we also have detail back into our shot. So if I turn this off and on here, you can see it does a good job of removing a lot of that noise within our image. And one thing I could do with the noise reduction, for example, let's say I want to remove this noise reduction from these reds in my photo. What I could do is I could click on this color dropper here. I could drop it on these reds. Now what that's doing is it's removing that noise reduction from those specific tones in my shot. So if I want to protect an area from this noise reduction, I can click on this color dropper. I can go in here and choose specific areas within my shot. I'll just choose midtones. Actually, let's choose shadows. So if I choose shadows here, and I turn this off and on, you can see in here, it's protecting these areas of shadow tones within my photograph. And I can modify the range to make it stronger or lighter. Perfect. So that's a noise reduction filter, really awesome filter for removing the noise within your shot. I would recommend it on astrophotography or any photo where you're shooting in low light conditions. All right, so last photo here and last filter in this video. And so what I've done here is I've gone and I've changed the camera profile for this photograph, and I've chosen AI Auto, and I think I moved this exposure down. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, basically just setting kind of a base look for this overexposed photograph here. And now we can head into the Effects tab, we'll add a filter, and our last filter here is Photo Filter. So Photo Filter recreates traditional solid color lens filters used for warming and cooling effects, as well as gradient, bicolor, and center spot filters. So the Photo Filter is basically emulating a filter on the end of your lens. So if I click on Photo Filter here, it automatically applies kind of a color cast onto my shot. And with the Photo Filter, basically you choose your filter type. So in here we have solid, graduated, bicolor, and center. So solid is going to apply this everywhere on your shot. We have graduated, which is going to be a gradient filter. Basically it's going to be applied to either the top or the bottom or the top 2/3, whatever it may be. And then we have bicolor, which is going to be 2 different colors on the filter. And then we have center, which is going to protect the center of your shot from the photo filter. So I'm just going to leave it on solid for now. And down here we have our color. So basically we can click on this box right here, and we can go in and choose the different colors for our photo filter. Now a lot of people don't know this, but in this colors dialog here, you can choose these different tabs, and you can go into different color areas. So for example, the spectrum one, you can actually choose from these different color spectrums. And then if I can go in here and I can go to these different color types. So if I want developer, I could use that. I could use crayons, web safe. So basically I have a lot more colors to choose from than just this color wheel here. But yeah, we'll head back into the photo filter. So let's say I've chosen a color. We'll just choose green. Now that I've chosen that green color, I can modify the hue. So if I want to bring it to more of a blue, I can go over to that. I can bring it to more of a red. I can modify the amount to make it stronger or duller. And if I want to incorporate more saturation to make it more vibrant, I can use the saturation slider here. So let's modify the amount, and then we'll pull up on the saturation quite a bit, just like that. And then polarizer is going to incorporate it with contrast. Basically, if I pull up on this polarizer, it's going to incorporate contrast with the filter, kind of emulating a polarizer on the end of your lens. So now that I've reset it, if we go down here to our mode slider, this will allow us to either choose clean highlights, clean shadows, we can have it applied subtle, or we can have it applied strong. Now strong is going to kind of bring in more of a contrasted look, subtle is going to be more of a subtle look from the filter, and then we have clean highlights. So if we want to protect our highlights, we can use this, and if we want to clean our shadows, we can use that mode right there. What I typically like to use is this 85. I really like the 85. Or you can come in here and use kind of any of these preset looks or colors. What I like to do with the photo filter is use it with an overlay or a soft light blend mode, or even a hue blend mode to kind of quickly change colors within my shot. So if I have this 85 blend mode right here, it kind of brings in a faded color cast onto the shot. But what I can do to bring in more of a dynamic look is I can go into my mode down here. I'll go down to soft light, and watch as I click on soft light. If I turn this off and on now, see how it's incorporating that photo filter, but it's applying it with sort of a contrasted look. So now if I pull up on my amount, I'm getting a lot more of that detail in the background because I'm adding it in with some contrast. Another blend mode you could use is the color blend mode. And the color blend mode is basically going to take the photo filter and apply it just to the saturation value. So whatever area has gray in it, this is where that blend mode is going to be applied to. But it's going to protect all of the tones in your shot, so it's not going to modify any of the contrast or the midtones or the highlights. So you can use this and kind of use these different colors in here, and it will just kind of use basically adding a nice color cast onto your shot without actually modifying too much of your photo. So the soft light blend mode, the overlay blend mode, and the color blend mode are awesome blend modes for the photo filter. Basically allows you to emulate a photo filtery look that was taken if you had a lens filter on your shot. So you could use 85 to warm things up, you could cool it down. Photo filter, awesome filter for landscapes, portraits, and pretty much anything you want to add a color cast onto. Thanks so much for watching part 2 of the power of filters. I hope you enjoyed watching and learned a little bit about using the filters inside Photo RAW. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned for more ON1 videos. If you like this video, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated whenever we drop new videos. Thanks so much. Have a great week.